Raymond Floyd, and this is my U.S. Open.
Looking back, if someone said, was there anything you missed in your career, it was the British Open. I never really thought about it playing. I kind of thought that I had the ability to win it, but I never did.
The truth finally revealed about Raymond Floyd is darker than you think. Sure, everyone knows him as a four-time major champion, but what they don't tell you is the story of a man whose greatest weapon became his curse, whose intimidation tactics made him more feared than loved, and whose rigid standards turned him into one of golf's most controversial figures. This is the real Raymond Floyd, the man behind the death stare, and it's not the hero story you expected. Raymond Floyd didn't just play golf, he weaponized it. His signature move wasn't a swing or a putt, it was a look. They called it the stare or the look, and it was psychological warfare disguised as concentration. Picture this, you're standing on the tee box at a major championship. The pressure is already crushing. Then you glance over and see Raymond Floyd staring at you with what people described as laser intensity. Players like Payne Stewart literally melted under that gaze during the 1986 U.S. Open. This wasn't sportsmanship. This was intimidation, pure and calculated. His caddy, Mark Huber, said Floyd projected a continual arc of static electricity. Floyd himself made it clear, I can't be disturbed when I'm in my office. The golf course wasn't a place for fun or camaraderie. It was his workplace, and you were just an obstacle to be eliminated. He was described as an absolute killer on the course, and that wasn't a compliment about his talent. It was a warning about his temperament. But here's where it gets interesting. That death stare, that intimidating presence that made grown men uncomfortable, it wasn't confidence, it was armor. Floyd was, at his core, kind of shy. The aloof, standoffish reputation that followed him everywhere wasn't because he was naturally cold. It was because he had to build walls to survive the pressure. The man who terrified opponents was actually hiding behind his own psychological shield. The tough guy act was just that, an act, born from insecurity rather than strength. And honestly, do you think Floyd's meltdown was pure pressure or karma catching up? Drop your thoughts below. I'm curious to see where you stand. And if you're into stories where legends lose everything in a heartbeat, hit that subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Floyd's intensity didn't just intimidate opponents. It made him a police officer of the game, and not in a good way. His most famous confrontation came during a Ryder Cup against Seve Ballesteros, a master of gamesmanship. Sev had developed a strategic cough that mysteriously only appeared when American players were hitting their shots. Most players would ignore it or complain to officials. Not Floyd. He walked right up to Sev and said, I heard you had a cough yesterday. You won't be having one at all today. After that confrontation, Sev's illness mysteriously disappeared. Was Floyd standing up for integrity? Maybe. Or was he using his reputation as Mr. Jugular, the guy who would bury you 10 feet deep, to bully an opponent into submission? The line between principle and intimidation gets awfully blurry when you're dealing with someone whose competitive philosophy is scorched earth. Floyd made it his personal mission to enforce rules that weren't even written down. He appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner of what constituted proper golf etiquette. What's particularly revealing is how Floyd's confrontational approach extended beyond single incidents. He became known in high-stakes money matches as someone you didn't want to face. The legendary tales involving him and Lee Trevino paint a picture of a man who didn't just want to win. He wanted to dominate, to make sure his opponents knew they'd been beaten. There's a difference between competitive excellence and psychological cruelty, and Floyd seemed to walk that line with disturbing frequency. The really troubling part about Floyd's intimidation tactics is how they were celebrated rather than questioned. Sports media glorified the look as if psychological warfare was somehow noble. They turned his ability to make opponents uncomfortable into a badge of honor. But let's be honest about what was really happening. Floyd was exploiting the mental fragility of other players, using fear as a competitive advantage. That's not the mark of a true champion. That's the mark of someone who needed an edge beyond pure talent. Consider the broader implications of Floyd's approach. When you build your entire competitive identity around intimidation, what message does that send to the next generation? That golf isn't about mastering your own game, but about breaking down your opponent's psyche? That the goal isn't excellence, but domination? Floyd's legacy in this regard is actually harmful to the spirit of the game. He normalized a win-at-all-costs mentality that prioritized psychological manipulation over sporting integrity. And here's something nobody talks about. Floyd's intimidation only worked because he was physically imposing and had the wins to back it up. What happens when someone without his credentials tries the same tactics? They get called out for unsportsmanlike conduct. Floyd got away with it because of who he was, which means his behavior wasn't about principle, it was about privilege. The rules, written or unwritten, simply didn't apply to him the same way they applied to everyone else. But Floyd's confrontational nature wasn't limited to the golf course. In 2013, years after his own Hall of Fame induction, Floyd publicly slammed the World Golf Golf Hall of Fame for lowering the bar. He called some inductees a joke and said the organization was taking integrity away from the term Hall of Fame. He pointed directly at the 2013 class, which included Fred Couples, who had 1 major, and Colin Montgomery, who had 0. Floyd's criteria was explicit and harsh. 1 major should not get you into the Hall of Fame, maybe 1 major and 40 wins. I'll just say that you should have at least 2 majors. At least. Now, Floyd had 4 majors, so it's easy to set the bar right above where most people can reach when you've already cleared it yourself. Was he defending standards or just gatekeeping to protect his own legacy? The Hall of Fame controversy revealed something crucial about Floyd's character. He didn't just disagree quietly or offer constructive criticism through proper channels. He went public, used inflammatory language, and essentially called out fellow professionals by name. Fred Couples and Colin Montgomery had to read headlines calling their Hall of Fame credentials a joke from one of their predecessors. That's not protecting standards. That's protecting ego. The timing of Floyd's criticism is also suspicious. He was inducted in 1989 at age 47, relatively early in the Hall of Fame's modern era, when standards were arguably more stringent. By 2013, the golf world had evolved. International players had elevated the game globally. The European Tour had become a powerhouse. Colin Montgomery had dominated the Order of Merit for years, but none of that mattered to Floyd because it didn't fit his narrow definition of greatness, a definition conveniently built around his own achievements. What makes Floyd's Hall of Fame comments even more problematic is the hypocrisy. This is a man who won his majors across 4 decades, which is impressive. But let's examine the context. His 1969 PGA championship came when he was young and hungry. His 1976 Masters was a dominant performance, no question. But then there's a 6-year gap until his 1982 PGA championship. That's not exactly consistent dominance. And his 1986 US Open, while emotional and hard-fought, required his wife to completely reprogram his negative attitude just to compete. So when Floyd criticizes players for not having enough majors, he's ignoring the reality that his own career had significant dry spells. He's cherry-picking statistics that favor his narrative while dismissing the overall body of work that makes someone Hall of Fame worthy. Colin Montgomery might not have won a major, but his consistency and dominance on the European Tour over nearly a decade is arguably more impressive than winning 1 tournament every few years. These 2 episodes, the Seve confrontation and the Hall of Fame criticism, reveal the same rigid personality. Floyd had one standard, his own. He confronted Seve for violating unwritten rules of sportsmanship. He confronted the Hall of Fame for violating what he believed should be the written rules of greatness. In both cases, Floyd positioned himself as the enforcer, the arbiter of what was right. But enforcing standards when you've built your reputation on intimidation isn't integrity, it's control. Here's the part that really exposes who Raymond Floyd was. The 1990 Masters. At 47 years old, Floyd entered the final round with a 4-stroke lead. He was poised to become the oldest Masters champion and the first player to win a major in 4 different decades. This was supposed to be his coronation, the moment that cemented his legacy as not just great, but historic. Instead, Mr. Jugular did the unthinkable. He backed off. The man known for never letting up, for burying opponents when he had the chance, played not to lose instead of playing to win. On the par 5 13th and 15th holes he normally devoured, Floyd laid up instead of attacking. He played it safe. He played close to the vest. And while he was protecting his lead, Nick Faldo attacked, making birdies and closing the gap. Then came the 17th hole, a 3-putt bogey. The lead evaporated. Suddenly, the man who had controlled the tournament for 71 holes was in a playoff, and the pressure was suffocating. On the 11th hole of that playoff, Floyd made what he later called a mental error. He pulled his 7-iron approach shot into the pond left of the green. Faldo parred the hole and walked away with his 2nd consecutive green jacket. Floyd admitted afterward, "The pressure basically got to me." He said, "This is the most devastating thing that's ever happened to me in my career. I've had a lot of losses, but nothing like this." And you know what? He was right to be devastated. This wasn't just a loss. It was a betrayal of everything he claimed to be. Mr. Jugular choked. The man who built his reputation on killer instinct played scared. The death stare, the intimidation, the rigid standards, none of it mattered when the pressure came for him. That pulled 7-iron wasn't a bad shot. It was the physical manifestation of a man steering the ball, trying to avoid disaster instead of attacking greatness. Floyd lost that Masters because he stopped being himself. The style that defined him, the offensive aggression, abandoned him when he needed it most. And in that moment, all the tough guy posturing, all the confrontations, all the rigid standards he held everyone else to, it all fell apart. But let's rewind 4 years earlier to 1986 because Floyd's career is a study in contradictions. Before Shinnecock Hills, Floyd had a terrible record in the US Open, and it wasn't because of bad luck. It was because of his attitude. He had convinced himself that the USGA was setting up courses unfairly, that they were no fun to play. This wasn't analysis. It was self-sabotage. He was beating himself before the tournament even even started. Then his wife Maria stepped in. She confronted him on the drive to Shinnecock Hills after he had just blown a lead at the previous tournament, shooting a 77 at Westchester. Maria asked why he faltered so badly. Floyd gave a defensive answer. Hey, it just happened. It was one of those days. Maria's response was brutal. I don't accept that. Something made it happen. She didn't let him off the hook. She forced him to confront his faulty thinking, to dig deep into the ego's resistance to self-examination. Raymond later described their 2-hour conversation as literally a war, but also a wonderful war. Maria reprogrammed him. She made him focus on the course's design instead of his complaints. She used Floyd's own confrontational style against him, and it worked. At Shinnecock Hills, the first round was played in torrential wind and rain, conditions that felt like a British Open. Floyd hit only 5 greens but shot 75. He walked off the course and told Maria, "I survived." That survival mentality, born from Maria's psychological intervention, carried him through the week. On Sunday, facing a stampede of 10 world-class players within a stroke of the lead, Floyd shot a brilliant final round 66 to win. At 43, he became the oldest U.S. Open champion at that time. So here's the contradiction. Floyd's greatest triumph came only after his wife used his own confrontational honesty to break through his mental walls. The man who intimidated opponents couldn't fix his own mindset. He needed someone to apply the stare to him, verbally, to force the breakthrough. His success wasn't because of his tough guy persona. It was because he finally let someone crack it open. Floyd's longevity, his ability to win across 4 decades, wasn't just mental. It was mechanical. His swing was ugly. Analysts said no teacher would ever encourage a student to emulate it. The most notable flaw was a clear over-the-top action, a move that's maligned and shunned in traditional golf instruction. But modern biomechanical analysis revealed something interesting. While Floyd's swing looked terrible, his sequence of movement was almost identical to players with perfect swings like Ernie Els and Vijay Singh. His body's use of the ground and energy transfer was biomechanically ideal. So Floyd's swing was efficient, but it wasn't pretty. It was functional, not elegant, and that's a perfect metaphor for his entire career. He didn't win because he was graceful or beloved. He won because he was ruthlessly practical. His short game was the same way. He popularized a chipping method called putting with loft, a clinical high-percentage technique that removed emotion and variables. It wasn't flashy. It was businesslike, cold, and effective. Floyd taught this method to many major champions over the decades, most notably Tiger Woods and Jim Furyk. The fact that Tiger adopted Floyd's technique is telling. Tiger, the greatest killer of the next generation, saw value in Floyd's cold efficiency. But here's the irony. Floyd influenced a generation of champions with his methods, yet he remains underappreciated. Why? Because respect for technique doesn't erase the memory of intimidation and controversy. Floyd's dual nature defined him. He was respected by fellow professionals as a pro's pro. Players like Freddie Couples and Davis Love hung around him to learn. Andy North called him one of those guys you wanted in your foxhole, and one of the classiest guys he'd ever been around. But that respect was conditional. It existed among peers who understood that his intensity was functional, not personal. The public saw something different. They saw the death stare. They saw the confrontations. They saw a man who called Hall of Fame inductees a joke. They saw the 1990 Masters collapse the moment when Mr. Jugular played scared and lost. The public didn't get the nuance. They got the headlines, and the headlines weren't kind. So what's the final verdict on Raymond Floyd? He was a man whose greatest weapon was also his greatest weakness. The intimidation that carried him through decades of competition also isolated him. The rigid standards that drove him to 4 majors also made him a controversial critic. The mental toughness that defined his wins abandoned him at the worst possible moment in 1990. Floyd's legacy isn't one of contradictions. It's one of consequences. His confrontational style produced results, but it also produced enemies. His intensity built a Hall of Fame career, but it also built walls that kept people out. He was an icon, yes, but he was an icon who paid the price for his methods. The truth finally revealed is this. Raymond Floyd was both the hero and the villain of his own story. His controversies weren't random. They were products of a lifelong war between his desire for control and the chaos of competition. He wanted to dictate the terms, to enforce his standards, to intimidate his way to greatness, and for 28 years it mostly worked. But in the end, the same intensity that made him Mr. Jugular also made him the man who pulled a 7-iron into a pond when it mattered most. Floyd wasn't misunderstood. He was exactly who he appeared to be, a ruthless competitor whose success came at the cost of warmth, whose legacy is inseparable from controversy, and whose career is a reminder that you can win championships and still lose something essential along the way. That's the real Raymond Floyd, and it's not the story anyone wanted to tell. So what's your verdict on Raymond Floyd? Ruthless competitor or misunderstood icon? Let's settle it in the comments. And if this deep dive opened your eyes to the drama behind golf's most intimidating face, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because the next story might just change how you see another legend.